The leader of the Palestinian militant group Hamas has called for a new intifada or popular uprising following President Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital. The U.S. decision has been widely criticized around the world and by some of America's closest allies, including Britain, France and Saudi Arabia. The United Nations Security Council will hold an emergency meeting tomorrow to debate the move. These are the latest pictures we have from Bethlehem, where tear gas and water cannon have been used to disperse protesters there. Well, the leader of Hamas, Ismail Haniya, declared the American decision an aggression against the Palestinian people.
Today, we call for and work for a new uprising against the Zionist occupation. Today, we won't have half solutions anymore. Today, there is no space or place for half measures. Let us unshackle our Palestinian people and let them express their rage and commitment to their historic right in Jerusalem and the whole of Palestine.
BBC Arabic's Nida Ibrahim is in Ramallah and sent us this update from one of the protests.
Oh, so as you can see behind me, there are a bit of clashes that are happening between the Palestinian protesters and the Israeli army. You can probably see the smoke screen that's created by some Palestinian protesters by burning some tires here on the ground. The Israeli army is responding mostly with tear gas bombs, and we're hearing that many Palestinians, maybe around 10, have been taken to hospital for injuries related to tear gas mostly. This is not the only location where we are seeing protesters. Many protesters are also gathering in Bethlehem, in Hebron, in Jericho, and many other West Bank cities in which also clashes have occurred between the Israeli army and the Palestinians. Now, these protesters have came all the way from downtown Ramallah, where there was a central demonstration that called for more support from the Arab countries. We've sensed a little bit of disappointment from the Palestinians, who say we expected a reaction, a bit of probably not necessarily from the Arab leaders, but from the Arab nations who have some sort of a relationship or a strong relationship to Jerusalem. So you could sense the disappointment here. But this is just to point out that around hundreds, maybe 400 to 500 people have gathered today in Ramallah.
Nida Ibrahim in Ramallah. Let's just show you some live pictures coming to us from Jerusalem. In the last few moments, actually, just before we cut to this shot, we saw water cannon being deployed on the streets there. Obviously, it goes without saying that the situation is extremely tense, and tear gas canisters being fired as well as the authorities attempt to control any demonstrations. And our diplomatic correspondent, James Robbins, is with me in the studio. And James, as we watch these images, well, it seemed pretty inevitable that we would see scenes like this following President Trump's announcement, didn't it?
It did. It was foreshadowed in much of the international criticism of the president's unilateral decision on behalf of the United States to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital, breaking ranks with 70 years of a very finely judged diplomatic response to the situation in the Middle East. Many countries, Saudi Arabia, seen as an ally of the United States, predicted exactly this, a violent response which they thought would be hugely disruptive to the peace process. Britain has been highly critical of the decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. I think this was utterly predictable. The question really will be, I think, the scale of any violence, the scale of any protest. And so far, without being complacent, it's been relatively restrained.
To what extent do you think that is, James, so far? Because other nations, allies of America, have criticized Donald Trump for this decision. Countries like Britain, like Saudi Arabia, as we mentioned, like France. To what extent are people in the Middle East, in the region, listening to those other voices and thinking, well, let's just, take a pause and see if we can control the situation without further violence?
I'm sure that those who are going to the streets are obviously listening to everything that's been said around the world and also by their own leaders in the region. It was no surprise that Ismail Haniya, on behalf of the Islamist group Hamas, would call for an intifada. That doesn't mean there will be an extraordinarily violent response. We should recognise that Hamas only speaks for a small number of people, and it's relatively weak at the moment as it tries to seek some sort of reconciliation with the other half of the Palestinian political world, that's to say Fatah, the Palestinian Authority. So Hamas was predictably going to do just this. We don't know what that will mean on the ground, but you're absolutely right. The scale of international condemnation may, to some people, be seen as some sort of legitimation of violent uprising, and therefore these days ahead will be very, very tense. Now, the United States itself, as the author of the policy, President Trump, as the author of the change of policy, knew precisely where this could lead in the short to medium term, because after all, just as he was speaking last night, the State Department, the United States State Department, was issuing a warning to its own diplomats to avoid all but essential travel in the region. So the United States knew when it let this particular genie out of the bottle that there were real risks involved. But President Trump, of course, insists that it's in the long-term interests of a two-state solution, although most of his allies don't see it that way.
Yes, his Secretary of State Rex Tillerson just talking in the last short while about short-term pain for long-term gain, in his words, and also saying the president is simply carrying out the will of the American people. Well, he's carrying out the will of a certain section of the American people, I guess, and certainly appealing to his core base of support. But he is overturning decades of US policy towards the Middle East. What sort of advice, representations were made to him not to do this?
Oh, we know there was a lot of pressure both internally within the United States and externally internationally on him not to take this step. Many countries, Britain among them, said to the United States, this will be very provocative and it prejudges a potential two-state solution. You're, after all, giving Israel a political gift if you acknowledge Jerusalem as Israel's capital, even if President Trump thinks that's merely a fact being recognised.
Premature, unhelpful. Those were the words that Boris Johnson used just a few moments ago.
That's right. And I think it's interesting what else Boris Johnson said. He was speaking at the Foreign Office a few minutes ago, and he said in answer to a question, this decision having been announced by President Trump, we, Britain, would like to see serious proposals for a long overdue resolution of the Middle East peace process. So Britain is saying to the United States, you now have a greater responsibility. It's not enough simply to take what we believe is a misstep. If you're serious about a Middle East peace process, you have to bring forward serious proposals for a long overdue resolution. So it's been batted back into Washington's court. It's not enough to provoke a response. You've actually got to come forward with concrete ideas about how you're going to help foster a peace process.
So a lot of eyes on Washington to see if they follow up this announcement with some other ideas. James, thank you very much for that. James Robbins.